Welcome to the ChargeForward podcast. My name is Jared Wright. Thank you for joining us here today. Today's episode is a replay of a webinar. So we just, Zach and I just got off a webinar. We're going to show you the webinar in just a few minutes here, where we talk about some of the preliminary data from our upcoming Chargeback Field Report. The report's going to be out in a couple weeks. Hopefully the field report will be out by the time you're listening to this. If you do, please go to Chargeback 911, search Chargeback Field Report. It's a great study. It's got a lot of interesting data points in it. We talk about a very small portion of that data in today's webinar. Yeah, and thank you for joining us. I'm just gonna kick it to the webinar. Zach and I, after the webinar, we had a big long conversation about the Q&A, and then we had some additional questions and some conversations. So stick it out through the webinar replay, and there's some bonus content for you at the end. Just a little housekeeping at the top, just because everybody always asks, the same questions. First question is, will a recording be available of this? We will make the recording available. It should go out tomorrow. However, not all of the webinar will be included in the recording. If you stay with us today, at the end, we're going to answer a lot of the questions that were submitted when you register for the webinar. Those questions will not be included in the webinar replay. So please stay with us today so that you can get those that extended conversation. Additionally, this webinar will be used in part in an upcoming podcast episode. That podcast episode will include the Q&A from this webinar, as well as an extended conversation between Zach and I on this topic. So if you enjoyed this webinar, please make sure that you subscribe to our podcast, however you listen to podcasts. It's ChargeForward with Chargebacks 911. We do webinar replays, and we do additional conversations with industry leaders on that podcast. So if you enjoyed this, then please do join us there. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to submit them. This is my first time using the new GoToWebinar dashboard. So I'm assuming that it's new for some of you as well, but I'm sure if you dig around, you should be able to figure out how to submit a question. Go ahead and submit those questions. We will, if we don't have time to get to them, we will make sure to reply to all questions that were submitted when you registered and submitted during the event after the podcast. We'll make sure that somebody sends you the information that you're looking for. Okay. Without any further ado, I'd like to go ahead and get started today. What we're talking about today is it's our Chargeback Field Report. It's a study that is based on a survey of, I believe, a little more than 250 merchants of all sizes. All that information will be in there. But globally, we talked to a lot of different merchants about the issues that they're having, the successes that they're having with chargeback management. And we're compiling that into a study. The study is going to be released in the next couple of weeks. As soon as the final draft is approved for release, we will send this out to everybody that registered for this webinar. So you don't need to fill out a secondary form. But if you do view the study on the website, it'll have some additional interactive features and things like that. So depending on how you like to consume data, that may be something that you want to check out regardless. Something I do like to talk about, because, one of the things that we're dealing with, and one of the reasons why this is an important study for us to do, is because there's a lot of unseen data and difficult to understand issues surrounding the chargebacks as merchants face them, as banks face them, as the card scheme deals with them. And one of the challenges around the data is that depending on your relationship to the data, right, the amount of data that you have, also the way that you engage with the data, you get a very different sense oftentimes about, what the underlying issues with chargebacks are. And there's I think it's an Indian fable, but it's basically the idea is if you have people, and they're blind men, and they're touching an elephant. Depending on where they're touching the elephant, they're going to describe a very, very different animal or object. And I think the same is sort of true with this data. And so I say all of that just to, set up the idea that, you may speak to a company or a bank, and they may have a slightly different take or interpretation or, understanding of chargebacks and fraud. I think it's best to understand all of it in aggregate. So look at what merchants are experiencing, look at what banks are saying, look at what the card schemes are saying, and really try to understand the landscape. So we do this study, and then we do a cardholder study where we talk to cardholders about, their experiences with chargebacks, and those are the two main pieces. We've done some additional studies, and we plan to do some as well with some internal data. But all of it is meant to create a bigger picture that's a little bit more complicated than the raw data that we're going to discuss today. First question that we asked is, how big of a concern do you consider friendly fraud within your organization? And this is a pretty straightforward thing, but I think that the headline number is that, 74% of merchants say that it's a moderate or significant concern, which is an overwhelming majority of merchants say that they're concerned about friendly fraud within their organization. This is, this maps onto what our understanding of the problem is. Zach, are you surprised at all by these numbers? Is this sort of consistent with what you see when you talk to merchants?
I think it's only surprising to me in the perspective that it's grown slower than I expected it to. Right. I think it's interesting, and I'm not to steal thunder, but we're going to talk about what Visa's measurement of friendly fraud is. And I think it's one of those times where it's interesting because I think merchants are finally starting to grasp the gravity of the problem. And so the only other thing I would say is the people that understand the problem get real fired up about it. And so I also think that that's kind of interesting, right? Significant concern is very heavily. And I would wonder if we went back, I think those are the same people that have always been concerned about it. So my other point with this is I don't think it's a new problem. I think people are just starting to realize that fraud is not all the same thing.
Oh, that's a very good point. In fact, we asked the same question about criminal fraud and how much of a concern that it was. And if you look at this, like back to back, they look fairly similar. They're the same color, and they don't seem that different in total. But if you really break apart the data, it's a 9% fewer merchants are concerned or significantly concerned about criminal fraud than they are friendly fraud. And the biggest difference that I like to point out is that 18% more say that they have no concern. And part of this is because sometimes there's a lot of merchants that just don't have a fraud liability. But I think it's also just because there's been an evolution in the market where merchants are starting to realize that friendly fraud from a chargeback standpoint is probably the thing that needs their attention. Is that, are you
100%? Yeah. I mean, I think traditionally fraud was, right, someone stole a credit card and used it on, and that's not what we're seeing is the prevailing problem. And I think the no concern, to your point, there are just some industries that don't have a problem with that. It's exclusively people that are raising service complaints saying that they didn't get services. Hotels, a great example, right? You're staying there for an extended period of time. In many countries, you have to offer another form of identification, right? It's not something. And so I think that this is interesting. It's really the idea that the light bulb is coming on. The majority of invalid chargebacks or fraud that's happening is people going to the checkout with the intent to commit fraud. And that's a very different thing when it's them using their own card, not someone else's. And so I think this is very much in line with the conversations that I have with people, but it's also the world that we live in. Chargeback fraud, according to Visa, right? We're going to get into that. It matches these numbers.
Yeah, I agree. We also asked merchants about, over the last 3 years, have they seen an increase or decrease in the amount of chargebacks, and then an increase or decrease in the amount of friendly fraud. Excluding the merchants that weren't paying attention or didn't really see an increase or a decrease, 73% of the merchants that noticed a change said that they had seen an increase in friendly fraud, whereas only 61% said that they had seen a net increase in the total number of chargebacks. And so this, to me, is a really, really clear indicator that friendly fraud is the driver, right? Because presumably there are many, many, many merchants who, are receiving the same amount of chargebacks, but a bigger and bigger and bigger set of those chargebacks are being attributed to friendly fraud. Now, that may have, honestly, in a lot of cases, that's probably always been the case, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But Zach, what does anything jump out to you about these numbers?
I mean, I think it's what you said, with there's some bias, right? We're paying more attention to it. It's become more of a thing, so people are measuring it. It could be the phenomena where it was always there, but we weren't measuring it, so we didn't think it was. But there's also, excuse me, we live in a world where if I go to the internet and I type in, "This happened, what should I do?" you get Reddit and an entire ecosystem of people saying, "Hey, raise a chargeback. Hey, you can do this." And the reality of it is that advice is not always correct. It's based on what they can get away with, not what a valid chargeback represents. So people are now getting passive coaching to go commit chargeback fraud without realizing it. And so I think that this definitely makes sense. And I think something I've spoken about in other webinars, COVID really contributed to that. There was a lot of stuff around travel and things like that that surfaced things that you could get away with that you're not really supposed to do. And I think the internet is really a contributor to that, because especially among the younger generation, they're throwing everything in ChatGPT sending them to Reddit, and hey, now they know how to do it.
A million years ago now, Visa changed all of its documentation and got rid of the term chargeback, or I think largely did, and now uses the term disputes to talk about payment disputes, and the actual chargeback mechanism. And so we've been, since 2021, asking merchants whether or not they more commonly, when they're talking about chargebacks or payment disputes, do they use the term disputes, chargebacks, or both evenly? And I was very happy to see that after the change there was an uptick in the people using disputes, and then that seemed to have abated. But this year, at least in the sample that we have, it seems like disputes is making a little bit of a comeback. So I don't know, Zach, is this, I have a lot of ideas about how complicated it is to talk about disputes. Just using the term disputes, it is more colloquial, but it isn't the most convenient term. So
I see this a little bit related to some of what Visa and MasterCard are doing, with now going back to wanting there to be like an alert or a pre-inquiry before a chargeback. And so, right, like as an example, when we talk about order insights is triggered at the dispute stage before a chargeback is raised. And I think that they're trying to kind of separate and talk about that way. I don't know if the taxonomy, and it's right, it's not really being used that way consistently. But I think that would contribute, at least to me, or right, how I would look at it in the uptick with that, because when we do talk about compelling evidence and order insights and stuff like that can stop a chargeback before it is raised, that would be, right, Visa would typically use language where that would be a dispute because it's not yet been raised as a chargeback. And so I actually like that perspective. To me, they're different things, right? The dispute process is all of it, and a chargeback is one of the ways that can be resolved. But again, I recognize that that's not a consistent way of talking about it in the market, and so I continue to chalk this up to as the joys of English language and taxonomy.
Yeah, well, what you're suggesting is my preference completely, right? The dispute is that there's an issue, right? There is a dispute, the dispute process, right? And a chargeback is a resolution mechanism for that dispute, right? There's several. I mean, it seems like every year or two there's another clever way that those disputes can get resolved. A chargeback is increasingly just one of those ways. But Visa's language, or at least last time I talked about this, in their documentation, have conflated a chargeback with a dispute and just used dispute throughout the whole thing. And so, it was part of the VCR update thing. It was the language around it. So it's just, that would be my preference. I think that's most merchants' preference still, but we do have an increasing number of people that seem like they're adopting the Visa strategy. And to your point, it gets complicated because not only do you have a dispute and then you have a dispute filed, right? But then you have to dispute the dispute, right? So that, at a certain point, we just need another word, and that's where chargeback, in my opinion, still is the logical choice. But we will be flexible, because ain't in a word is not true anymore. So just like everything else, we're going to have to be flexible. This is the first year we asked this question, but there's, friendly fraud and chargeback fraud used to be a binary choice. And then some people started using first party fraud. And I did like that because it was sort of easy to contextualize compared to third party fraud. It's, kind of a useful term. And then they softened it up even further with first party misuse. And so connotatively, or which one is this? Connotative or connotatively, denotatively, they're all basically synonyms, but they're connotatively, they have different emphasis, right? Chargeback fraud being the most harsh, friendly fraud, being sort of like a halfway point, still uses friendly fraud. And then first party fraud, I don't know, is a little more high-minded, but first party misuse is really just kind of the softest way to tiptoe around the topic.
Technically, though, right?
Yeah.
Misuse is anytime someone uses their own credit card and files a chargeback knowingly or unknowingly, they have misused it. Abuse is a subsection of that, where they're doing it intentionally. And so I agree, it does give you a mindset into, do they think people are doing it intentionally or not intentionally? But technically, it's two different things, right? Because merchant error can also create first party misuse. It shouldn't create first party abuse, because first party abuse is, again, them going in with the intention of doing it. And so from a personal perspective, I like the first party, third party, because I think I oftentimes have to explain to people the difference, right? We'll sit down and we'll talk to a customer and we'll say, hey, this is what's going on. And what really helps people click is first party versus third party. Whose credit card were they using?
Yeah, I actually, well, so I have two. I agree with you on the first party misuse. I think it's the most accurate, right? One of the things that we've struggled with, throughout the years when we're talking about friendly fraud and we're saying, hey, this is a really big problem, is making sure that we sort of open up is it the Overton window? Am I going to use that term? But just open up the lens on friendly fraud, so that it includes all of the unintentional and sort of like innocent uses. And the word fraud does sort of get in the way of that understanding. So from a utilitarian standpoint, first party misuse is the most accurate. I just don't think it rolls off the tongue or is nearly as catchy as friendly fraud. So, I'm biased. The poet in me is biased towards friendly fraud. The analyst in me agrees with you entirely. First party misuse, but when we use them, we use them synonymously. When we've said friendly fraud, we've always meant the broadest definition of friendly fraud. And so people are understanding it different, and there is utility in that, but just purely from a definitional standpoint, they're different words that mean the same thing. And friendly fraud is go ahead.
Sorry, a cool point to be made, though, is now we're starting to analyze it. And I think that's the key. Not all fraud is the same, right? What causes misuse is different than what causes abuse. And so I think at the end of the day, to me, what's really cool about this is you're seeing people start to dig into it and understand that problem, because ultimately different problems have different solutions.
Okay, so this is a new way that we're displaying this data. It's based on some questions that we've asked merchants kind of going back, and we always kind of get to a similar, we get fairly similar numbers, but I think that this graphic explains it in a way that is a little bit easier to understand. And so we have 77% of the merchants that we survey said that they dispute at least some chargebacks. They say that they dispute 62.8% of illegitimate chargebacks. The average win rate of those people is, this is self-reported data, is 44.6. And then those that are tracking second cycle disputes say that the average number of second cycle disputes is 19%. And obviously second cycle disputes, the vast majority of merchants are not going to continue disputing that. So there's really no data beyond that point. But what that ends up with, like every time you move a little further down this funnel, is that the net recovery rate is 22.7%. And so the disparity between what merchants track versus what merchants are actually keeping is pretty significant, because they're only disputing a portion of the illegitimate chargebacks. And this is illegitimate chargebacks in their mind. And then they're only winning a portion of those. And then the ones that they are winning, a certain number of them are getting overturned by the issuer or the customer. So, Zach, how do you talk about this when you talk to merchants? How do you get them to pay attention to net recovery rate versus first cycle win rate?
Well, I mean, I think this is something that comes up all the time, right? People will throw win rates out, and I always have to ask questions to get it. Okay, are we talking about a net win rate or a gross win rate? And so I think sometimes there's people that don't even understand that there's a difference, right? They're kind of looking at it as, okay, they track their win rate and then they don't realize that the settlements are coming back differently. But I think at the end of the day, this is pretty consistent with what I see, right? These numbers make perfect sense to me. What I would really call out, or what's making people pay attention to this, the fines and the fees are changing on this stuff. So now, right, if somebody files a pre-arbitration, there's fines and fees potentially from Visa and MasterCard. And so I think that's drawing more attention to the stuff that falls out of the bucket at that second life or second cycle dispute level. And so I would say, I think this is something that more people are paying attention to, and it's not coincidental. I think that that's because Visa and MasterCard are realigning the fee schedule in a way that's intended for that to be the consequence.
Well, that's good. And then the punchline to me is even more drastic than what we just showed, right? So if you remember, it was 44 something percent is the number that chargeback teams are reporting on their books, and they're telling executives, this is we're winning 44% or 50% or whatever it is, and then the actual number is like 20%. The actual number, in my opinion, is maybe even as much as half of that. And the reason is because we talk to merchants, and even the merchants in the survey that we just said are paying attention to friendly fraud, that are aware of the issue, that the vast majority of them say that it's a major concern. When asked to estimate the percent of their overall disputes that are attributed to friendly fraud, the average percentage was 43.8. And this is significant because Visa claims that the percentage is 75%. And then because of what we're talking about with that Overton window, I probably used that wrong, but we talk about the lens, the understanding of what friendly fraud is, we think that number is as high as 86% for the vast majority of merchants. And so when you have merchants who are self-diagnosing 43% of their chargebacks, they may be understanding half of the total friendly fraud problem that they have, right? They're probably, this number, I would be willing to bet this number, what they're answering is non-fraud reason codes, right? Because that basically lines up with what the stats are, right? Like I think it's around 60% of reason codes are fraud, at least last time I looked at the numbers. And so they're going basically off of reason codes, but there's a whole other bucket of illegitimate chargebacks.
And mathematically, if you take half of the 60% or so and add that lands pretty close to 75%. So, right, personally, I think that this is people waking up to the idea that things filed as fraud may not actually be fraud. But what's interesting to me is usually you don't have a situation where someone like Visa is saying, hey, this problem is this big, and the merchants are going, nah, it's only this big. Right? Usually it's the other way around. And I think that's the point that I made earlier. The merchant, like the light bulb's coming on and people are starting to wake up to it. But it's interesting to me because Visa's already acknowledging it. And an interesting way of reading this is that a lot of non-fraud reason codes probably represent some form of misuse. And a lot of the fraud reason codes would have to, because to your point, there's not enough non-fraud stuff to get to 75%, right? So Visa on some level is acknowledging in that stat that there are things filed as fraud that are not. And I think, right, compelling evidence, things that we've seen change under VAMP are also starting to get at that. But I think that's the really big thing is that it's a combination of, I'm filing a service chargeback, maybe on a refund I claim I didn't get, or a product that I did get and I claim that I didn't, but it's also claiming fraud when it's not. And I think that that's a new thing, and those have very different solutions because they're very different problems.
Yeah, claiming fraud when it's or just still having no good solution to the item not recognized problem. Where there's a lot of chargebacks that are just, I forgot that I ordered it, I didn't recognize it, I have a shared account with my wife, I have kids that have the credit card in their computer, whatever. There's a lot of accidental first party misuse, to highlight the utility of that term, that's not captured accurately in reason codes. And then it's anecdotally kind of a funny story, because we've been saying 86%, that's been our number. And oftentimes we will cite the Visa number or other numbers. But we've been saying 86%. And then, at the time, the only other number that was out there by any other credible source was saying 40%. And so we were out there saying 86%, everybody else is saying 40%. And gradually over time, the industry's moved towards us. And I think there's still a little bit more room to move. I still think that 75% is probably undercounting it slightly, but it's a lot closer to on the button than historically the way that this topic's been talked about. So it's important. Okay, so challenges that merchants that are fighting chargebacks or disputing disputes rate as the highest. The highest is evidence collection. I'll just go through them real quick. I know it's small text. Evidence collection, visibility across systems, time requirements, understanding the root cause, reconciling outcomes, staffing and training, rule changes, and other. I don't know. Is there anything in this list that is there anything that you're surprised isn't higher in the list, or is this what you expected, or what are your thoughts?
I'm not surprised that it's not higher, but it definitely says something that it's not higher. Managing rule changes, stuff changes all the time. VAMP has changed a lot of stuff. compelling evidence is changed under VAMP. All that stuff impacts representments. It impacts all of it. And I think it's interesting that that's not higher, because it should be higher in my opinion, but I think it's not, because people just don't have time to pay attention to it. They're just trying to get the evidence and get it out the door. They're not worried about, did the rules change in the last 30 days? And so maybe that's where that comes from. But I think otherwise this makes perfect sense.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of times merchants don't realize how much rules change, right? And part of that's intentional, right? Depending on the relation. Like, so there's rule changes that only, like when Visa makes a rule change, there's a set of rule changes and a regular communication of rule changes that only go to like issuers and payment companies, right? And then there's a smaller set of rule changes that only go to merchants that have active merchant accounts. And then there's like every once in a while they'll come out with a rule change and they'll publicly talk about it. Like we can't even talk about, because we have access to all, but we can't talk. There's an embargo. Plus, it would be incredibly boring because there's so many rule changes that come out. But they're constantly updating, and so I think a lot of merchants, unless they're really plugged in, and paying attention to that boring a release document that they make available, probably aren't aware of all of the things that change constantly. It's one of the values that a chargeback management company can offer, and for a long time it's been, I think, one of the things that we do really well. So I agree. So the first one was evidence collection, and then this year we asked, what data sources do you get the information that you need in order to dispute chargebacks, right? So evidence collection. So I'm not going to go through all of them here, but you can see that there's a lot of different options. So there's all of these areas, and I think sort of distilled down version of this is that 63% of the merchants that we talked to said that they rely on 3 or more data sources in order to compile a single representment case. So that means logging into 3 different systems or accessing different systems, or, there's almost a majority that would be at the 4 and 5 or more number of systems. So it is complicated. It can be complicated for merchants to put all this stuff together. Speaking of one of the things that chargeback management companies like Chargebacks 911 can do, what is it that you see? Because I know you talk to merchants, and part of what you do is help them connect all of these different systems so that we can pull data from it. Are you surprised that this was the biggest challenge?
No, not at all. I mean, at the end of the day, the joke that I want to make is I'd like to see the representments from the people that are only using one, because they're either not very good, or the person that's pulling it is, they think they're using one, but there's a team that like built them an enterprise data warehouse, or right. There's a lot of engineering that goes into surfacing all of that. And if your organization hasn't done it, to your point, that's a place that our organization and I really lead that discipline come in. But no, I mean, that's the thing. Fighting a chargeback is telling a story. And unfortunately, as technology evolves really, really fast, the number of platforms and systems and data sources is only going up and to the right. It's not going down. And so I think in order to be able to tell that rich story, pull all the right stuff, it really requires going into different systems, whether that's a gateway to get stuff like, verified by Apple and that it was an Apple Pay purchase, or any number of things. But no, this is exactly the challenge that we solve, and really what I'm responsible for leading is, right, by scale and a variety of other things, we have the expertise to be able to do that much faster. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's not that tough to respond to chargebacks if you have all the data in one place. And right, like obviously there's an asterisk there, but that's the single biggest problem that people are saying. And that's the other thing. Noting, by the way, evidence collection, visibility across systems, that's the same thing. Time requirements, that's can I get it done quick enough? But that probably ties back. I mean, almost all of the stuff on the left-hand side, representment challenges in some way, shape, or form, either tie to or constrain pulling the data together. To me, it's the single biggest thing.
That's a really smart observation. I completely agree. Okay, so we know what the problem is. But something that we're starting to talk about and trying to educate the market on is the problem of in-house collusion. And I'll try my hand at defining it loosely, but I'm sure that you'll probably do better than me. But this is a liability that is created by your employees, either intentionally or unintentionally, that are driving up your chargeback stats. So Zach, I think you have some examples, and then
for sure.
Okay,
so
yeah. So what is in-house collusion?
To put a face on this, this is any form of a situation where a customer service experience, rather than resulting in a refund, the person is either coached or encouraged to go file a chargeback, or they're acknowledging that that's what they're going to do, and they're not, right? Like the agent isn't able to provide a refund instead. It's essentially situations where you have a customer on the phone, they're voicing that an action needs to be taken, and instead of fixing the issue outside of a chargeback, they're being pushed toward it. I can actually give examples of this. In the last couple months, I have been told by more than one merchant, while contacting them in an effort to resolve something without a chargeback, that I should just go file one. And I think this is problematic for a bunch of reasons, right? I think there's organizations that the customer service agent may not realize that, right? They may be trying to help the customer find a remedy because they don't have the ability to help them. And so again, this is a very unique problem, but I think it's something that we need to start looking at, because from a consumer culture, it's no longer a viable business practice to hold the customer hostage and hope that they're not going to find their way to a chargeback, because more often than not, they're going to be. They're coached by their bank, they're coached by their, right? It's easy to do now. And so it's basically taking a look at, do you monitor for it? Like, are we looking for situations where we're creating chargebacks? And then, do you think you have a problem? Yes, no. And I think, Jared, you had some interesting call outs, because more than half of people either don't know or don't monitor.
Yeah, that's true. Right. Yeah. So we asked, 23% said that they're actively monitoring it and they don't believe it's a problem. Everybody else is either knows it's a problem or doesn't know it's a problem, in my opinion.
And I'd be willing to believe that, because if you're monitoring it, you can coach against it. But ultimately, to me, this isn't a situation where, and I don't like the word collusion, right? It feels uglier than it is. It's not usually someone looking to rip off the business. It can literally be, and that was one of the situations, was I was talking to a customer service agent. They could tell I was frustrated, and they said, "Sir, I don't have the ability to help you, but you could call your bank."
Yeah.
Okay. That's not a situation where you need to yell at the agent. That's a situation where you need to analyze your customer service practices and decide if you're okay with those being sent to chargebacks, because you have someone on the phone that, and in this situation, right, I work in chargebacks. I filed a valid chargeback. I got my money back. It was a situation that they weren't doing what they were supposed to do around their refund policy. So I think it's an important thing to look at. If you're not looking at it, you probably do have a problem, because people aren't doing it because they think they're being naughty. They think they're helping the customer. That's my experience.
Yeah. If you're setting up your client relations, first of all, people that are in client relations, you want to hire empathetic, kind, patient people, right? But then if you don't give those empathetic, kind, patient people the tools to, help, and you don't educate and create really, tight policies around this, then they're going to encourage, and they're going to, in some ways, make the problem worse for you rather than better in a lot of cases. So it's a complicated problem. We're just starting to talk about it. I'm kind of just starting to get my head around it, but that's real interesting that you had that situation, because increasingly it's something that's on our radar here. Okay, so if you're listening to the webinar replay, I'm going to say goodbye to you here. But if you're on the live webinar, keep on sticking around. We've got a few questions that we're going to answer. We are almost out of time, so we'll just go, and then if you guys have a hard stop, then you can drop off, and Zach and me, neither of us will get upset. But we have a question from Brian. He wanted to know, previous changes that were designed to assist merchants have not helped our winning percentage. Are we alone? Is there any push in the industry to address how card issuers handle friendly fraud? And this is a super complicated question to rush through. So let's take our time, Zach. What are your thoughts here?
So to begin with, no, you are not alone. I think what I would start by pointing out is that once something's become a chargeback, the representment process is governed by the issuer. The issuer ultimately decides whether or not what you submitted takes precedence over what their cardholder is saying. I'm not going to get into whether or not that's fair and unbiased. It is what it is. Another fact, under Compelling Evidence 3.0, the pre-deflection service that Visa's really putting a lot of adoption effort behind, the issuer doesn't have any more say than the evidence they raised, the information you and Visa looks at it. If Visa sides with you, you don't pay the chargeback. And so what I would say is yes, I do think that there is a push in the industry to clean this up. I think a big part of that is Compelling Evidence 3.0, because that service, if you're unaware, when a customer raises a chargeback or attempts to raise a chargeback, if you successfully provide the information as a merchant to deflect that chargeback, the customer still gets their money back. The issuer is who pays for it. And so that by its very nature, is kind of a accountability aspect to it, because now the issuer has to pay for the chargeback that they attempted to raise. But I could also see a world where in the future, that's something that's looked at from a compliance perspective. So what I would say is, yes, it is getting better, but I think a lot of that is going to be key is trying to resolve it before it becomes a chargeback, because ultimately that's going to be where you have the ability to really submit data and let the data speak for itself, not submit the data and hope that a logical decision is made by someone that's at the issuer.
Yeah. And I think it's a complicated question too, because we've got, from the merchant perspective, it's sort of like, well, we still have the same number of chargebacks. They've made all these changes. We're not recovering chargebacks, but you have to understand that Visa's aware that friendly fraud is on the rise. So they are doing things that sort of like combat friendly fraud on the front end. But all they're doing is just treading water, right? So for most merchants, you kind of see an incremental increase, but the front end solutions that they've implemented really haven't done a lot because they're paired with an increase in attempts, right? The number of disputes is going up. The number of chargebacks is, what they're trying to do is stabilize that chargeback number. And then as far as the representment, I think that's a whole other thing. I don't like, the Compelling Evidence 3.0, but it's just also not something that I've seen that they've focused that much on, trying to fix, right? It's more front end type solutions. It's once it goes through the representment process and the back and forth, that's still in a lot of cases a really legacy system. Am I wrong?
But also, no, you're completely correct. But the other thing, once it hits a chargeback under Visa VAMP, it's on your chargeback ratio whether or not you win. You get a fine for having a chargeback raised against you. Winning that doesn't give you the fine back. And so from the perspective of actually preventing and addressing friendly fraud, the only way to actually do that functionally is to stop it before it becomes a chargeback. And so right now under Visa, that's Compelling Evidence 3.0, which is attached to Order Insights. And under MasterCard, it's First Party Trust and Consumer Clarity. Both of them amount to a real-time data exchange. And ultimately, if you can implement against them, strongly recommend doing it, because that's how you can protect yourself. And then I think you will see that get better over time, because it is something that Visa is very focused on under VAMP.
Okay. Noel wanted to know, how important are merchant terms and conditions in the eyes of the networks?
So I'm going to assume this is in the context of a representment. And the first thing I'll call out depends on the reason code. So, right, if the customer is saying, I didn't get my product or merchandise, that's probably less relevant. But if they're saying, I didn't get it as described, absolutely relevant. If they're claiming fraud, you can submit the merchant terms and conditions. It's still a good idea, but it's not going to change the outcome. I think there's two takeaways here. Your terms and conditions need to be written in a way where you're not doing anything that's creating chargebacks. Yes, you can do things in your merchant terms and conditions that will contribute to them. But then also in closing them, they are absolutely compelling evidence depending on what the claim that the customer is making in the chargeback.
Yeah. What the claim is, and then also what the evidence is, what the specific terms and conditions is, right? So if it's something where there's no reasonable expectation for you to disclose that clearly in the checkout process, then having it in your terms and conditions is generally pretty strong. But if it's something like recurring billing or some whatever, even things like uh, if no refunds are allowed or things like that, like stuff that's kind of out of the ordinary, our recommendation is to make that something either that they agree to or at least make it visible in the checkout process, and then you use that checkout process as the compelling evidence, right? So you submit the terms and conditions, the big long legal document that they have to click through. But if it's something that is super important, make sure that you communicate to the issuer that this was very easy and possible for them not to realize when they were checking out. Because depending on what it is, some issuers won't care that it's in your terms and conditions if it was, seems like it was buried there.
To Jared's point, right? That is very, very common. The explainability and understandability component of it. If you sign someone up for a recurring billing, to use the example, it would be really great at the end of the checkout to be like, okay, so in summary, you're signing up for a billing, right?
Yeah.
And because if you go to your issuer and you go, well, it was in the terms and conditions, that's not going to win, right? So I think to Jared's point, the terms and conditions are a really, really important piece of the story, but it's about telling the whole story and how that comes in.
Okay. Is it possible chargebacks are handled differently by the customer's bank, so by the issuer, depending on my company's credit card processor? So I think we talked about this. This is a reputation question, right?
Yeah. So the way I'm reading this is it possible that a transaction processed to the same issuer via two different acquirers or processors will be treated differently? And the answer is yes. That issuer is fully aware of where that process transaction's coming from, because the merchant account that you're doing it on has an acquiring bin, and that acquiring bin is a bank identification number. So it tells them all of the stuff that we're talking about. Bins, just like on credit on the issuing side, are used for risk groups and things like that. So where you're processing does indeed tell the issuer something about your business. And issuers also listen to these signals and use them slightly differently. But in the shortest answer possible, yes, it absolutely will impact things, all the way from acceptance rates to even how often a chargeback is raised or the decision that's made.
Yeah, definitely acceptance rates and stuff. And this is one of the challenges, is being able to diagnose, as we're giving this advice, I feel like, it is also entirely possible that it's a misdiagnosis and you're worried about the wrong thing. So, yes, it can be an issue. It wouldn't be the first place I would look. Is that fair to say?
Well, so what I would say is it depends, right? If you've got, as an example, you're running all of your merchant initiated payments on one and all of your customer initiated payments on another, and they're two processors with very different profiles of customers, because at the end of the day, remember what that bin is it's a group of the other people using that processing. So it's essentially saying, hey, when I present this transaction to Bank of America and it's from Stripe, how is that different than when it's presented from another processor? And so just thinking about reasonably, what does that mean? Are they different risk profiles and things like that will give you some sense of it. If there aren't differences, then as Jared said, probably not the smoking gun, but it is absolutely something that they are able to see and is part of the decision-making process at those levels.
Yeah. Yeah. As well as your reputation as a merchant. Assuming that you get more than a couple of chargebacks, it's fairly easy for issuers to get to know, or sort of prejudge chargebacks to specific merchants. But we're not going to talk about issuer initiated disputes yet. All right, so Diego's got is VAMP general, or each PSP have their own thresholds?
My glib answer is yes to both of those. So VAMP is a little confusing because VAMP is the Visa acquirer monitoring program, and it has two different tiers. There's the monitoring that Visa applies to the acquirer, which is at one threshold. That threshold is lower. And then there's the merchant threshold, which is your individual processing on your MID, and Visa checks that. So it is possible to have a situation where you are below the merchant threshold, but above the acquirer threshold. In that situation, if you had that situation with two different acquirers, you could definitely have one acquirer that doesn't say a word to you, no fines, no conversation. And you could have another acquirer at the exact same threshold say, I want money, I want a remediation plan. Because the way that the program is designed is that anyone that's above the acquirer threshold, it is at the discretion of the acquirer to manage that, because the acquirer is responsible for keeping their portfolio below that. So if you're processing with someone who's got a bunch of customers way down here and you're up here, it's much more likely that they're not going to say anything. And so this is an individualized conversation at your acquirer. And that's exactly why our CB911's advice and Visa's advice from the beginning has been to have a conversation with your acquirer, because that is going to set differences where you have VAMP as an overarching umbrella and then the acquirer level differences beneath. Not that different to how the federal and state level legal systems in the United States work, where as long as the acquirer is not doing anything that is against the overall VAMP regulations, there is a degree where it can be different from acquirer to acquirer.
All right, and this will be the last one, because I appreciate a lot of people have stuck around, so thank you guys for sticking around. But Timu, not the retailer, says, what impact might digital, or I'm probably mispronouncing that, might digital receipts have on the market, if any? And I actually it didn't click with me what they were asking, but you have a sense of what Timu means here. So Zach, why don't you talk about that?
So I don't read this as digitized receipts. I read this as the product digital receipts, which is an Ethica collaboration product. And so the way that I would answer this is I view a lot of that data exchange as very valuable, because it increases the amount of data that can be exchanged quickly while a dispute is being raised. However, I think I would look at digital receipts and consumer clarity very similar to Order Insights, and Order Insights just gets a lot more time because of Visa VAMP. But it's a data exchange, right? It's saying, hey, Jared, what you bought was these 4 products, and it still relies on 2 things. Jared going, oh yeah, I do recognize that, and not raising a chargeback, and or the agent or application that's in between Jared and this experience having that talk down. So it's possible that you send that information, the issuer is not using it, it's not displayed, nothing happens. It's also possible that you show it to Jared and Jared's on the phone to do naughty things, right? So he's just going to say, hey, no, file a chargeback. And so the idea is that I think digital receipts can be very important but it's not about on its own. It's about the idea that it's part of the ecosystem that then qualifies that inquiry for consumer clarity and first-party trust. And first-party trust is the analog to compelling evidence, with the idea being that that's how you can submit the evidence to stop the friendly fraud claim before it's raised. And so I think it's an important part of the ecosystem, but on its own, it's not really even designed to do something, right? It's part of a suite.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Like, I think the improvements are always incremental. So Luna asked, how do you see chargebacks APMS, and which challenges we can face? Are you familiar with the APMS acronym?
So I think it's APM, like, and then a small s, alternative payment methods.
Like plural?
Yeah, like alternative payment methods is what I'm getting with that. Okay. So the challenge with alternative payment methods is that there isn't always a standard dispute process. So Chargebacks 911 does get involved in that more often on our FI 911 side of the house, with helping to manage the actual dispute process, and then kind of tie that into making it similar to how it would work with a credit card. Again, it depends on the alternative payment method. Right, as an example, APM includes gift cards and a bunch of stuff that like there isn't a scheme or anything to attach to. But what I would say is yes, we can typically help with that. It's going to depend on what alternative payment method, but we do work a lot with local acquirers in South and Central America and North Africa on the APM problem. And so, yes, alternative payment methods are something that we can have a chat about, but the devil's in the details with that one. So it's hard to give a blanket answer.
Okay. Well, hopefully she checks out the podcast and gets that answer. This user was, I think they were just trying to whinge a little bit. They said, we get chargebacks anyway, even when the agent tries their best to help or offers partial refunds. Yeah, you're gonna. Zach, I don't know. Do you have any advice or a reality check for them?
I mean, again, since a representment is adjudicated on by an issuer, it's not as consistent of a process as we would like it to be, because there's lots of humans and lots of places and lots of cultures to manage with each organization. But something that we have seen be helpful, you can train your agents to get specific acknowledgement that the remedy that they're offering satisfies the customer. I think that's a place that we do see people take advantage of with it is they're like, well, yeah, they did that, but I never said that I was happy. And so I think the issue with this is ultimately if the customer goes and files a chargeback, there's nothing, right? Like you can't stop them from doing that. It's putting everything in place to tell a story that you operated in good faith, have already provided that to them, et cetera. And so what I would say is focus on your evidence building. But then also, what's the underlying problem, right? What is that customer unhappy about is usually the more fruitful way of going, right? Because if you have a continuous problem with that, I would take a look at what's driving the dissatisfaction. Examples being, we've had customers that we've worked with very successfully that have looked at things like a high cancellation rate with seasonality. We looked at it and realized that by offering people an opportunity to pause their subscription for a period of months, they don't get cancellations and chargebacks. They get happy customers that are only paying when they want. And so I think there's a degree of that as well. If you really can't satisfy the customer, you're either doing something wrong and not providing a remedy, or you have a friendly fraud problem. And I think understanding which of those is happening is ultimately the need.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, I mean, this is not an area of my expertise, but I know that good customer service, like every time I talk to a customer service agent at a company that is doing everything that they can, I get a satisfaction survey. And so to Zach's point, if the things that the agent is doing, whether it's the partial refund, I mean, you may be offering partial refunds, people are still upset, and you're still going to get chargebacks, right? So it may be that you should stop giving partial refunds. So understanding that scenario, how often people are satisfied, and there's ways that you can extrapolate too. So if you look at if you can get a relatively accurate number of dissatisfied customers after a customer service experience, you can figure out the math on what percent of those are going to file disputes, and you could get a real solid understanding of what your chargeback liability is by changing terms and conditions. So if offering an immediate full refund anytime there's a complaint at one end of the spectrum gets you, prevents X number of results, and you can do this based on satisfaction surveys, not necessarily chargebacks. You don't need to wait until you get all the chargeback data in. And then on the other end, you go harder and you say, well, I'm not going to do any refunds at all because, when I do partial refunds, it just makes the problem worse, or it doesn't make the problem any better. So understanding your data is really where I would recommend that merchants be. I don't know that it's reasonable for any merchant to be gunning for zero chargeback as a goal. The reality is that you're going to have customers that are going to, well, I mean, outside
Jared, I wonder, but I wonder if the reason why this question or where this is coming from is I give them a partial refund, right? And then they go file a chargeback for the whole amount. So now I'm out whatever I gave them plus the refund, right? Like the full amount. And so I think if that's the spirit of the question, then the answer is don't give partial refunds. But the other thing that comes to mind because at the end of the day, banks are not good at raising partial chargebacks. The app doesn't usually make it real easy to find that option. If you're doing it through an app, the customer service agent doesn't do it right for whatever reason. So you wind up with it's $50. I already gave Jared 25 back, and now he's got 75 in his pocket, and he's right, I'm out. And but the other side of this is it depends on your ticket value, because if you're processing with like Stripe, you're getting $15 a chargeback just for having one hit you. So if you're giving them a partial refund to save 10, what's the other half of what's the value that you're not refunding? And if it's less than $15, I think that's a real easy conversation, because at the end of the day, if they go file a chargeback, that fee is a big part of it. And so I think understanding that holistically is where I would coach that. But I'll also just give it a quick call out. This is a great opportunity to, if you're not working with a provider, give us a call and we can talk about this specific challenge, right? We can help you analyze this, and this is something that we might be able to specifically help with.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously all of that. I guess just to reiterate my point, or to push back a little bit, obviously do the best customer service you can. Happy customers have benefits for your business well beyond the chargeback issue, but purely as a chargeback issue, being comfortable with a small amount of chargeback liability is oftentimes makes more business sense than doing everything humanly possible to make sure that nobody's ever upset with you, because it creates liabilities around return abuse, refund. Like there are costs and consequences to a zero chargeback policy. So whatever. All right. Christopher is saying that 36% of our first rounds go to second rounds, and that's a 10% uptick year over year. So knowing zero about Christopher or his company, what would be some of the things that you would look at?
You said it's a 10% uptick year over year?
It's a 10% uptick, and he's 36% of his successful representments are overturned or escalated to second cycle.
Got it. Okay. And there's no information about industry or anything like that?
We could look it up. I just don't want to call him out.
Okay. No. I just, that's fine. I think what I would say is chargebacks are just going up. That is endemic with the statistic, right? Yeah. If anybody that's got chargebacks and they're not doing anything, they're going up and to the right. So that 10% doesn't really surprise me.
Well, no, is it because it's a 10% increase of the second cycle rate? So I don't think he's saying it's a 10%.
So second cycles in particular.
So presumably it was 26% last year or the year before, and then last year it was 36%. So one, is that number high? Or what would be some indicators?
Depending on industry and what reason code you're contesting, that's right where I'd expect it. We also have seen that the second cycle overturn rate has gone up, meaning merchants are seeing more successful first cycles be overturned as a pre-arbitration request.
Okay. So let's talk about what are some of the scenarios that lead to second cycle. So I understand the super basic one, which is I call my bank, I file a dispute because I never got a product. The company puts together paperwork and they include delivery confirmation for another order. Accidentally, the issuing bank accepts it, doesn't look at it too closely. I get it, and I go, this is delivery confirmation is for a completely different product. This isn't my address. And then I call my bank again and I say, wait a minute, why did you side with the merchant? Look at this evidence. This evidence is malarkey. What other ways
you just described the most flowery sunshine and rainbows version of what happens. So usually what happens is, and that's why I say reason code matters. If it's a fraud claim, there's situations where I file a chargeback, the merchant responds with the stuff that, right, and the issuer usually goes back to me and I don't respond quick enough, so they side on behalf of the merchant. I still have the ability to file a pre-arbitration request. So this is more often what happens is I've thrown in a fraud chargeback, the merchant responds, the issuer goes okay, and I say I don't agree with this. And for fraud, right, like unless they've provided like ironclad type stuff, so what we see is it's people that'll do like an AVS match on zip code, not the full thing. If I want to file a pre-arbitration against that and claim that it wasn't me, I can do that.
Yeah.
And so it depends on the reason code. But what we see a lot of, and this is unfortunate, and I think this is a place that I hope we see a cleanup happen. When you reopen your case, you're supposed to speak to all the evidence that I've supplied and add something new. Sounds logical, right? We don't see that a lot. A lot of times we'll just get back, the customer doesn't agree, right? That kind of thing. It's like, okay, well, cool, the customer doesn't agree, but what about the evidence that was submitted? And so it can be a frustrating process. And the reason that it winds up landing there is that the high cost of fighting a second cycle prevents most merchants from engaging in it. And so I do think that there's a degree of bad behavior, which is another reason why I would plug back to having everything in line, utilizing compelling evidence 3.0 to stop friendly fraud and things like that. Will start to change those issuer behavior signals, because that's the last point that I would tie in with this. Issuing chargeback teams, especially for ones that are being contested and overturned, that's where your name gets brought in. That's how they learn your name. And so there's a behavior concept with it, right? If you're on the phone all day working cases with customers and you're hearing the same story from lots of customers, that bank is going to start to believe that. And so oftentimes with these, it's really important to dig into and understand what exactly is happening. Do you have a bunch of people committing the same friendly fraud scheme, or are you actually doing something that should be addressed from an operational perspective? High level though, unfortunately, overturns at the pre-arbitration level are going up across the board. I don't have anything insightful on why that is. It's an observation that we have seen.
Okay. So does it need to be the merchant proactively raises the dispute a second time or complains about the verdict? Isn't there a sort of like halfway point or something where the issuer can initiate or resubmit it or something like that? Like what are the circumstances when that happens, and how do you diagnose what's going on there?
So that's less common on resubmissions, because remember, the issuer has to side with the merchant to begin with.
Yeah.
So that would essentially be me waking up and saying Jared wins, and then tomorrow being like, nope, I changed my mind. Right. So that doesn't happen as often. We do see it happen sometimes where a case is closed out in the merchant's favor because the customer didn't respond. And then if the customer responds later, the the issuer will reinitiate it for them. That's more often what we see. Now, issuers raising chargebacks on behalf of customers does happen all the time. It's first cycle chargebacks that we see that on.
So I think that was the scenario that I was familiar with, sort of that fell outside of that normal sort of understanding that I had. Okay, so that's with the fraud chargebacks, with the new Visa collaboration, or not collaboration, the other one, but with the new Visa process, how that you kind of like stampede through the dispute cycles. You're saying that the issuer communicates to the customer doesn't respond, so the verdict is defaulted to the merchant, and then once that happens, the customer says, no, wait. Okay, so that makes sense. Something like that. So that would be a good thing. It would be, these are they fraud reason codes? Because that would be something to look at, and that just may be, the new reality that you're in. If they're not fraud reason codes, I would look at the cases that you're submitting, right? I would just look at them, because those cases, if there's something different that you're doing as far as the compelling evidence, right? The compelling evidence needs to convince.
I've got one to look at. I'm sorry, because we caught someone doing naughty with this.
Oh, you got an example?
Yeah. So
perfect.
Another thing that savvy fraudsters will sometimes do is they know that they can wait out the tracking numbers working. So they'll file a claim, right? You'll submit the tracking number still works. They can reopen it later after the tracking number is taken off of FedEx's website and use that as a basis of, and so, right, like that's something to take a look at. And that's actually part of like when we do documents, we go grab a screenshot of it and save it.
Yeah.
So just to call out there, like that's another thing that can happen is like there are service things where, like, again, I promise you, I hunt the dark web and look for naughty people talking about naughty things. And like people talk about that. Like that's on the Reddit landscape where people have acknowledged that, like, hey, something you can do. And it's one of those, like, FedEx and those delivery services typically only keep them for 90 days. I have 120 to file a chargeback. And once I filed a chargeback, I have up to 90 to keep it open. So it's really easy for people to exceed beyond that. And so, right, like depending on your process, if you're just pitching over the live link, you might be causing your own problem.
Yeah, that certainly in that, it can be so many things. Yeah. But like also even just the language that you use, right? Like because that's when people think about the cases that they put together for a representment, right? The audience is the issuer, the sort of person in the chargeback department at the issuing bank, right? But the ultimate audience is going to be the customer, right? When that case is overturned, the majority, if not all, of your representment packet is going to go to that customer. So like if you're doing, like if there's something in there that's just not technically true, or a technicality, or a type, like, you know, if you're rude in the way that you summarize the circumstance, right? If you you know, phrase something in a way that gives that incentivizes the customer to you know, object, right? If you're putting too much information in, you're creating a liability where they can say, look, this isn't true. I don't know why they said this. So yeah, like you kind of have to think beyond the issuing bank and look at and try to get in the head of your customer. Are they going to be as receptive to you winning based on this packet? Because sometimes, you know, I think it's smart to put into a case information that isn't intended necessarily for the issuing bank. Don't put stuff in there that they're not going to want to see, but that, you know, you're conscious that the end user is the customer. We were helping a really large company at one point deal with credit card disputes, and it turned out that a lot of them were account takeover fraud, but they had a really clear process for no, excuse me, that wasn't it. It was family fraud. But the company had a really clear process where if a parent called and said, hey, my kid used my credit card, they would just refund stuff. So they had a really clear process. But when parents would just call and just file it and say it was a fraud, then you know, the company was obviously disputing those cases. And what they did is they put like instructions into the representment case. Now it also helped their case because it said this is what they're supposed to do. But the parent would receive that case and then say, oh, you know, I should have gone and done this. There was this remedy available to me. And I think it may have even still been available to them. So that's something where, you know, you're putting information in that that sort of like helps reduce the second cycle dispute. So
I have one last thought. So
okay, go ahead.
I don't believe that most people are intentional fraudsters, right? Or professional fraudsters. I do think that most people engage in friendly fraud much more commonly than they're willing to admit, etc. Right? I think a lot of people do it without understanding. But there's a component to this where, to Jared's point, the bank is supposed to send the representment package to me. I'm supposed to review it, especially if I'm contesting the outcome of the case. I get a copy of it. So there is a degree of shaming people into, right, not pushing it further. It doesn't mean that it's going to stop them from it. But as an example, we do have customers that do KYC type stuff where people have to submit a picture of themselves holding their license and things. And the reality that we live in is if they go to their bank and they say, that's not me, they'll let them reopen the case. But by including that picture that says, and here's a picture of them holding their license, most reasonable people that are not professional fraudsters are less likely to do that. And so bearing in mind that level of the evidence can actually make an impact. And this is an example of a customer that did see a marked reduction in second cycles on what was obvious first-party fraud.
Yeah. Okay. So somebody also asked about this. What would account for the uptick in pre-arbs? We'll just say second cycle because it's a confusing term, especially when the story has been adequately and accurately told. Ooh, they quoted you in the first round. Is it automation of the option to go to the second round? Can PSPs be the issue? Also, it seems like there's no transparency at arbitration level despite the insane fees. Why is that?
So that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
Arbitration is ultimately defined by the network. So that is why it works that way. I think like the industry is actively working on, and I think moving in a direction where that's becoming a bit more of a transparent process. But I think Visa, MasterCard, the networks have been very clear. They don't really want to be in the business of arbitration. They would rather focus on the other side and resolving the disputes before they turn into disputes. And so I think that's where we're seeing more of that. At the end of the day, what I would say is, with your pre-arbitrations and what would account for that uptick, I think it's a combination of factors. I think consumers are becoming more educated on how that all works, and the fact that people don't get in trouble for doing naughty things is becoming available on the internet. You'd be surprised how well, what if I get in trouble? What's going to happen? Is my bank going to close my account? Now you can go out online and it's pretty accurately documented. People talk about doing this and not getting in trouble. So I think that contributes. But then I also think that VAMP, TC40s, and the overall focus on that has really turned into kind of a push back and forth between issuers and acquirers. And I think you're seeing a little bit of it happen there. What I would say is the biggest thing that you can do is take advantage of all of the pre-dispute deflection services. And I don't mean alerts where you're refunding it. I mean first-party trust and compelling evidence to really make that case up front, because for friendly fraud, that's usually where we're seeing people push this. Because at the end of the day, I think most people would agree, if someone stole my credit card and I'm filing a legitimate claim, right? You don't want to win that case. I should file a second cycle, that type of stuff. So again, I think these invalid second cycles are, again, friendly fraud. And so that's a different behavior pattern. And so taking that in mind, I think really leaning into stopping it up front and showing that is going to be the way forward. Because again, I would be shocked if we didn't see in the next 16 to 24 months issuers starting to be held accountable for the number of chargebacks that are prevented by compelling evidence.
Yeah, I think those are really good thoughts and good advice. That second question was also from Christopher. So, but this question, this is from Alan, and this is also about the second cycle stuff. So this is really interesting that was a really key stat. He said, what is the 19% loss due to second cycle disputes? Is that where the chargeback was legitimate and thus probably not friendly fraud? Was the merchant therefore at fault somehow? So I don't know what he means by at fault here, but like,
so I get it. I think what he's asking is like, does that 19% mean that 19% of cases, like, the merchant won it and they shouldn't have? And I don't think that's it at all. Because I think what everybody needs to understand is that the barrier for someone to open a second cycle is very low. It's supposed to be higher than it is. Again, they're supposed to respond to everything that's in there and add new information. And I think what I would say is somewhere that a provider like Chargebacks 911 that also works on the FI side of things, we know a little bit more about it, and there's another process that we can help with around that merchants don't necessarily have access to. But the idea is that those are second cycles that are not technically being managed correctly. Where merchants lose is because in order for you to fight them, you have to assume the risk of $500 to $700 in fees for losing. And so they win by virtue of backing you into a situation where you can't afford, or it makes no financial sense to fight further. And so what the customer is essentially doing is just going, I don't accept that outcome until you give up, because in pre-arbitration, where you might actually be able to win, the risk is too high for you, because again, the customer doesn't have to pay anything. If they take it to pre-arbitration and lose, their bank pays it.
Yeah. So is there something, I think back to Christopher's question, is there something, it would be interesting, do we have any insight into the different ways that different issuers communicate losses to their customers? Like, do they invite them to file a second dispute in any cases? I know that you were talking about in the fraud cases or whatever, they sort of have to, but in the collaborative, the non-fraud,
almost every issuer that I've ever seen, when they give you the outcome. So, right, thinking through, if you filed a chargeback, it says, okay, we've applied a credit to your account. In the next 30 days, this credit will either become waived or it'll become permanent. We may let you know before then. And right, you go through that. Usually you get a, hey, we've done the research we need, the credit's now permanent. What that usually means is that the chargeback request was accepted. So right, like an Ethica, an RDR or something like that caught it. The bank confirmed that we got a refund. So now your credit's complete. If that doesn't happen, right, merchant fights it, you will get a notice back. I've had a merchant fight a chargeback that I filed. They've submitted evidence and they've said, well, hey, here it was. And it was a situation where my credit card was stolen. And this happens. Merchants sometimes just submit to everything. They take, well, hey, and I mean, it was like, okay, well, this booking was for someone with a totally different name, booked on an IP address in Southeast Asia. Right. Like, and I looked at it and I said,
that's my example. That's my example.
But literally had happened. And so I no, but what I'm saying is like, I genuinely didn't, and they didn't win it. So but your bank doesn't just make a decision. They bring that evidence back to you. It's supposed to be a back and forth. Right. Like that agent is supposed to say, okay, they submitted this. And I look at it and I go, no. Now in the situation where if I don't answer, the issuer can look at it and make a decision, but most often they will close it in the favor of the merchant because they responded last. That's the situation where I could look at it and go, whoa, what do you mean? And open it again later. But basically that's what's going on. And so, but what happens is when I'm notified, so if my issuer sides against me, which I've also had happen, you will be notified that the credit on your account was removed. Yeah. And they almost always, I've never seen an issuer not give some kind of statement that basically says, if you don't agree with this outcome, this is what you do.
Yeah. Well, but this is what I'm saying. So like just how apps are,
they're inviting it. They're making it easier.
Encouraging chargebacks. They're making it easier.
They're not saying this is the final decision, right? Yeah. Like we stand by it. They're saying, no, this is the decision we made. But if you don't agree, click this button.
Yeah,
and that's gotten easier and easier.
Follow this link and fill out this really easy form.
No, true stats, friend. True stats. Yeah. In the last 3 years, a major bank converted from, if you wanted to contest a second cycle, you had to fax a signed copy of the document package back to them, to now you can just click through online.
Yeah.
That's what's contributing to it, friend. I got news for you. I had a chargeback that I lost that was 100%. I didn't take the time to find a fax machine. So that merchant got to keep their money. Right. Yeah. And I'm telling you, it was a valid chargeback. That threshold is gone. And that's a bank that I bank with. And I'm telling you, it's one of the largest issuers in the world. Right. And so, right, like that contributes to exactly what we're talking about, is the barrier has gone down. I'm invited to do it. I push a button, bing, bang, bong. And I never get slapped on the hand. There's never a negative. The worst that happens is the credit gets taken away.
Right. Whereas it would be insane in most instances for a merchant to take it to a second cycle.
Correct.
Okay. All right, man. Well, I think we've gotten enough secret content here. We've basically only talked about one thing. So, thank you for joining us. Of course. Thank you everybody for listening. This has been a long one. All right.